be examining the Ming and Qing dynasties of China. To get us back into context, if you remember the last time we looked at China, we were talking about China ruled by outsiders, right? They were the Mongol Yuan dynasty that was founded by Kublai Khan. That was overthrown in 1368. And the Mongols actually were in power for less than a century. The Ming dynasty assumes power in 1368. It remains in power until 1644. And when the Mings take over, they return to traditional Chinese rule, right? So the Mongols were outsiders. They were not Han Chinese. Now we're going to have the traditional Han Chinese returning to ruling China directly. And during the dynasty, Ming rulers managed to stabilize the East Asian region for nearly 300 years. The Ming era is also going to see the arrival of Portuguese and other Europeans, which definitely was aimed at encroaching upon the Asian trade network. So there's a lot of continuity and change during the Ming dynasty. You know, on the one hand, you saw at least an attempt to try to keep out outsiders with the strengthening of the Great Wall, the attempt to get the Mongolian outsiders to stay north, but at the same time, their seaports are still open to outsiders, and this is definitely going to change the dynamic of China. And in 1644, so talking about the Qing dynasty really briefly as an overview, that was established by Manchus, so they're from Manchuria, not China proper. They seized power and established the Qing dynasty in 1644, and they're going to rule until 1911. They're also the last Chinese imperial dynasty before we get to the Republic of China, which we'll talk about in the next historical period. And the Qing dynasty, China gets really big. It essentially makes up all of its modern political borders. We'll look at some maps later. And another thing to realize is with the increased global connections during the Qing dynasty, there is an event that really weakens them with regard to outsiders and definitely leaves China more open to imperialism. And that was the two opium wars in the 19th century. Okay, so the Ming dynasty experiences a period of economic growth. There's political stability, which definitely helps China's economy grow. The silk industry is going to grow in particular. Under the Ming dynasty, the silk industry was actually controlled directly by the imperial government. So what they did was they assigned people who worked for the Chinese bureaucracy to be in charge of factories. And these people also were supervised by an imperial commissioner. And so, you know, you have basically this nationalization of China's silk production. But there comes a point where there's such a demand for silk from outside countries that increasingly private silk factories are going to start to crop up. And even though they were still enforced by government officials, there is signs that there was more corruption then. So basically, what you're going to have is that quotas for silk production were not always met. So, like I said before, that increased demand is going to make more work assigned to private factories. And some of those factories were actually supervised by eunuchs, and historical sources reveal that they abused their power in those situations. You're going to find that under the Qing dynasty, silk production becomes more efficient. The Qing find a new organizational system for their silk factories and make the management more efficient. So during the Ming dynasty, you have two different capitals. In the early stages of the Ming dynasty, Nanjing was the capital. We also call it the southern capital. It's important for us to note also that when the Ming take over, when they're really trying to get rid of all the previous Mongol influences, they spend quite a bit of money and attention to beautifying the city. So one really nice example is this tower here that's looking over Nanjing. Nanjing actually has a very modern-looking cityscape for the most part, but you know, some of these monuments here give you a sense of its long-standing tradition and its history. Nanjing was the capital of China from 1368 to 1421. It was established by the first Ming emperor. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. Nanjing was a walled city, which is really important. So the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty made sure that there was this very, very strong and tall wall that kept Nanjing protected. This wall actually was also really well preserved. So if as a tourist, you can still go and walk around on the wall. It circles all of the older parts of Nanjing, but it has expanded quite a bit in modern times. As you can see these more modern buildings here in the back. Nanjing was believed by historians to be the largest city in the world in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. And also Nanjing was where Admiral Zheng He, the Muslim eunuch explorer, was born. And we'll talk about him a little bit more later. The second capital of the Ming Dynasty was Beijing. This was the northern capital. You can see that it's located farther north, closer to Manchuria and Mongolia, of course. It was the capital of China from 1421 to 1644, which was when the Qing Dynasty took over. The Ming emperor that was in charge of the construction of Beijing, well, the establishment of Beijing as the capital, rather, was named Yongle. And he commanded many new construction projects in Beijing, including the Forbidden City, which you can see here. The Forbidden City was like this imperial complex, all these buildings, all the members of the royal family lived there, as well as his concubines. It was a very, very large and walled complex. It was surrounded by a moat. It's still one of the most popular tourist attractions in Beijing, and it just gives you a sense of the grandeur of the monarchy, how they're held in such high esteem that they're actually sort of segregated from the rest of the Chinese citizens. The idea, of course, it was called the Forbidden City because, people who aren't affiliated with the government and aren't close with the emperor were not allowed in. And then down here, you also have another very important architectural achievement under the Ming Dynasty. Rather, this is the Temple of Heaven. This is also in Beijing. This is where rulers would perform Confucian-based rituals to ensure the well-being of Chinese society. And again, the Temple of Heaven was also commissioned by Emperor Yongle. Also, Beijing had an inner and outer wall, rather, that was built around it, similar to Nanjing, but the inner and outer walls of Beijing, there are very few remnants of them because in the 1960s, they tore most of them down to construct a subway. Beijing supplanted Nanjing as the largest city in the world, and it remained the largest city in the world until the 17th century with the end of the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so one of the really important things that the Ming leaders do, first and foremost, is that they want to get rid of all the Mongol influence that had sort of robbed traditional China of its culture over the past century or so. Essentially, they want to return beliefs and customs from China's past, the former great Han, Tang, Song dynasties. So they aim to erase all Mongol influence under the Yuan dynasty. They discourage people from dressing as Mongols and taking on Mongol names. Rulers are going to promote ancient ways of thinking and Confucian teachings. This also means that they bring back the traditional civil service exam, which had fell into disuse under the Mongols, and same thing just with the bureaucracy in general. One of the things that we discussed when we covered the Mongols was that sometimes the Mongols actually appointed outsiders to be bureaucrats rather than actual Chinese people. So if you remember, Marco Polo actually served in Kublai Khan's court for a long period of time. So in any case, they're going to make sure that all the bureaucrats now are from China. They are Chinese proper. They're Han Chinese. They're not from Mongolia or anywhere outside. So they're really trying to sort of bring themselves back to that traditional Chinese base. They also improve education. Obviously, that's connected to the civil service exam. They establish a national school system to do this. And the global effect here is that with increasing contact with other cultures, Europeans are actually going to learn quite a bit about the civil service exam, and some European bureaucracies are actually going to start to imitate this system in the 18th century. So it's really important for us to realize that that sense of the meritocracy by no means was just limited to the East. Obviously, this is not going to change all of the structures of European governments. Clearly, there was nepotism and sort of more traditional practices for appointing bureaucrats. But at the same time, there was some connection with the outside world with this. Another thing that Ming China does to try to sort of get rid of some of the things that were happening under the Mongols, they want to restore its agricultural traditions. Remember that the Mongols were nomads, and so they were more interested in having grazeland for their animals. So this means that a lot of farms fell into disrepair. So what the Ming emperors are going to do is they're going to restore millions of acres of land so that they can cultivate again. In order to do this, they're going to rebuild canals, reservoirs, and irrigation systems to make sure that there is plenty of access to water. They're also going to go against, there was some deforestation that took place under the Mongols as well for obvious reasons with, the idea of promoting more graze and pasture land. So the Ming emperors also commissioned the replanting of millions of trees. The Ming Dynasty military has sort of a mixed reputation. On the one hand, it did expand the size of China. You see that at its height, the Ming Dynasty conquered lands in Mongolia. It also conquered lands in Central Asia. It's pushing up into Manchuria, as you can see, even parts of, essentially Siberia, very northern Russia here. But it is not always going to expand to that point. In the 1440s, you're going to have Mongol invasions. Realize that even though the Mongol Yuan dynasty was over, there still were Mongols living in this part of the world, so they try to launch an invasion. They actually take the Ming emperor prisoner. So you're going to see that some of the Ming gains, if you look at this map down here, are going to actually retract. So by the time you get to the end of the Ming dynasty, because there are outside invasions, not only from the Mongols in the north, but you also have Japanese pirates who were invading from the sea. This is going to actually make the borders of the Ming dynasty smaller towards the end. But nonetheless, you are going to see other important military achievements. Notably, the Great Wall is going to get strengthened and restored. It also wasn't very well maintained during Mongol rule. One of the problems with the military, though, was that military soldiers were still of low social standing, and so that meant the morale was low. People weren't necessarily, in a really patriotic way, running to join the military. And of course, like I just said, these outside invasions from Mongols, the Japanese, are going to increasingly weaken China's military stronghold. One of the really, really significant accomplishments of China during the Ming Dynasty was its period of exploration in the 15th century. And this is really a small window in Chinese history, too, because they largely tried to be isolated. But in 1405, you're going to have this man here. He was a Muslim eunuch, an admiral, named Zheng He. He was sent by the Ming Emperor Yongle on 7 great voyages throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And actually, some historians speculate that he even reached the Americas, but they haven't established any proof of that, not at least in a concrete way. So the purpose of his voyages was to display the might of the Ming dynasty to the rest of the world, and also to receive tribute from them. So the idea was that Zheng He and the Ming dynasty, they weren't trying to actually find new products to take back to China. They just wanted to show off how great China was, and that's a distinct difference from a lot of the European exploration that took place later on in the century. Another thing that's really interesting is that Zheng He's ship, even though it was built almost a century before Columbus's, Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, his ship was much larger. You can see this scaled comparison here. Zheng He's main ship, it first sailed in 1405. By contrast, the Santa Maria first sailed in 1492. Zheng He's ship was 123 meters long, and the Santa Maria here, which was Christopher Columbus's largest ship, was only 27.5 meters long. Zheng He's ship was 46 meters wide, and the Santa Maria was only 9 meters wide. Also, at their height, Columbus's fleet had 17 ships and 1,200 men, and Zheng He's fleet had 300 ships and 25,000 men. So just a huge difference there in size. But nonetheless, Zheng He sort of, for a long time, got the short end of the stick historically, and European explorers were emphasized much more. And another thing that you can even take note of here is the length of the voyages. So historical records show that he reached as far as these Swahili trading city-states here, like Mozambique. Even though you could argue that Columbus's journey across the Atlantic was also quite long, notice how many times he actually stops and engages in trade with other places. He's interacting with Malaysia and Indonesia, with India, with the Middle East, and also, of course, throughout East Africa. So unlike that, Columbus's trade network is really just across the ocean and then with various ports in the Caribbean. So one could argue that Zheng He actually exposed China to a much wider array of places, whereas Columbus did not. So the purpose, I already talked about this a little, but the purpose of Zheng He's voyages, on the one hand, was to win prestige for the Chinese government and also to open up new markets for Chinese goods. On the other hand, they didn't really try to purchase foreign goods and bring them into China. But still, because they exacted tributes from societies that they came across, Zheng He would sometimes return with really exotic goods. So the previous slide showed actually this slide here, showed a giraffe. That was one of the most famous gifts that Zheng He brought back from his voyages to Africa. You also had new understanding of the world beyond China's borders because of Zheng He's voyages. Also, these voyages inspired some Chinese people also to branch out, and some of them actually emigrated to the ports that the expedition had visited in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So I guess Zheng He's explorations almost contributed to, I mean, it would be a huge exaggeration to call it a Chinese diaspora, but still there was some Chinese culture that spread out because Zheng He sort of opened up the path for exploration. At the same time, though, realized that his voyages were very limited compared to European voyages. It only goes on during Zheng He's lifetime, and then they abruptly halt, whereas European exploration, as we know, continued well into the present day, or at least into the post-colonial period. So Zheng He's, like I said just now, Zheng He's voyages end very abruptly. So one of the reasons is that the emperor that sponsored him, Yongle, is going to die, and his successors are not nearly as supportive of future expeditions. So his successors, Yongle's successor was Zhu Gaozi, and he thought that the expeditions were too expensive. So even though Zheng He is still alive at this point, he ended his travels, and he also discouraged all Chinese ships from leaving China. He actually made it punishable to build a ship that had more than 2 masts. So basically you're going to have overseas exploration in China ground to a halt. Another reason why Zheng He's voyages were controversial was because the return to Confucian traditions in the Ming Dynasty promoted a really stable agrarian lifestyle, and there was this fear that great interaction and trade with foreign cultures might threaten China's social order. And the other thing is that some people kind of questioned why there would be any need to actually interact with outside societies, because there was this belief among a lot of Chinese elites that that other cultures were inferior to China, so they questioned why China should have any interaction with outside cultures at all. Nonetheless, outside cultures are certainly going to interact with China, even though Zheng He's voyages end in 1433. That's only a temporary period of isolation, because by 1514 you're going to have Portuguese traders arrive in China. The first Portuguese merchant that arrived in China was this man here. His name was Jorge Alvarez, and this is actually a statue of him in the city of Macau, which was a Portuguese colony for quite some time. So the reason we already kind of discussed why Portugal is the pioneer, but just as a reminder, they have some of the most advanced ships and weapons at the time. They invented the caravel, which was able to support deep sea, high sea voyages. At this point, Portugal had also already won control of both African and Indian coasts. Portugal had a series of forts stretching from Hormuz on the Persian Gulf to Goa in western India, to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula. So they had this really serious network of other trading ports that allowed them to continue east to Macau. And the aim of these trading forts was to establish a monopoly of the spice trade throughout Asia. The problem was that the Portuguese Empire was limited in that it only had a series of small outposts. It didn't have control over larger territories. The initial Portuguese visits actually didn't have a huge impact on Chinese society. But then shortly after, a little bit later into the 16th century, you're going to have more and more Christian missionaries arriving in China. And the arrival of these missionaries arguably has a greater impact on China. So at first you're going to have Franciscan and Dominican monks, and then later Jesuits. They're going to arrive in China throughout the 16th century. They are going to attempt to win over the Chinese with their scientific and technological knowledge. They impress some Chinese with their learning, but the scholar gentry also was sometimes less easily impressed. They still kind of thought the Europeans were barbaric. But still you see this, there's definitely a cross-cultural interaction going on with Christian missionaries in China. So what's going to happen is that as time goes on, the Portuguese are going to be very much more vulnerable, and they're not going to be able to maintain their monopoly over the spice trade. And so some of the reasons why that is A, because they're too small of a nation, they lack the manpower and the ships necessary to enforce or maintain a large trade empire. Many Portuguese merchants ignore their government and try to trade independently, so that's not going to benefit the Portuguese government, right? It's not going to give them money to strengthen their military or anything like that. You also have corruption among government officials that inhibit the trade empire. And then in the 17th century, you're going to have an increased presence of other European countries in Southeast Asia, most notably the Dutch and the English. So they challenge the Portuguese monopoly in East Asia. Eventually, you're going to have conflicts between the Dutch, English, and Portuguese over Malaysia and Indonesia. And in 1620, the Dutch are going to capture Malacca, and they built a fort at Batavia in Java, which is now Jakarta. The Dutch also then attempt to monopolize the spice trade instead of the Portuguese. Now, the English focus more on India, but they also are responsible for pushing the Portuguese out of South Asia. I'm going to stop this video here, and then we're going to pick up with the second video, which will talk about the Qing Dynasty.